I'm Peter Robinson of Uncommon Knowledge. Today, an interview with, by far, our most requested guest, Thomas Sowell. We filmed this interview last December, that is December of 2024, and it's a special interview. I've interviewed Tom over and over again over the last quarter of a century, but always before, we've been discussing one of his books. How did he come to write the book? What are the arguments in the book? What have the critics said about the book? How does he answer the critics? But always that book. In this interview, we're going to be hearing about Tom Sowell's life, beginning with the small home on a dirt road in North Carolina where he spent his first years. Then we moved to Harlem, we moved to the Marine Corps, and on it goes. We're used to thinking of Tom Sowell as being Tom Sowell, the author, the brilliant intellect. In this interview, how Tom Sowell became Tom Sowell. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Thomas Sowell has studied and taught economics, intellectual history, and social policy at institutions that include Cornell, UCLA, and Amherst. Now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Dr. Sowell has published more than 36 books. By my count, no fewer than 45. And then if you add the anthologies and the revised editions, it gets up to 70 books, Tom. Tom Sowell, welcome back.
Good being here.
On every other program we've recorded over the years, we've been talking about a specific book of yours. I'd like to talk about your early life, although there is a specific book, A Personal Odyssey.
Yes.
But I have questions from other books as well. Let's go back to the beginning. Before there were books, before Tom Sowell had become the Thomas Sowell, and I'll be quoting often here from A Personal Odyssey. Before you were born, your father, who was dying, asked his aunt to raise you because your mother already had 4 children to raise on the wages of a maid. You didn't know until much later that you were adopted, and visits from your mother to see you, and I'm quoting again A Personal Odyssey, were managed so well that I grew up to adulthood with no memory of the woman who came very unobtrusively in my early years supposedly to visit with the adults, close quote. Your father died before you were born. You didn't know your mother was your mother, and in fact, you have no memory of her. And yet you write of your childhood, these were some of the happiest times of my life, close quote. How?
Well, I think I was much more of a celebrity at that point to my family than I've ever been since then. I remember when I was much older, I had a son of my own, and like many new parents, we want to know, when is the child supposed to do this and do that?
When do they first walk? When do they cut their teeth?
Yes. And so the last surviving member of the family in which I grew up, I asked her, how old was I when I first began to walk? She said, oh, Tommy, nobody knows when you could walk. Somebody was always carrying you. And in later years, when I did research on child development, among other things, I was struck by what an emphasis people put on those first 3 years of life for the child's development. And when I thought back to that, I was really quite lucky because those were really probably the 3 happiest years of my life.
You were adored.
Yes. And the people who are constantly trying to get children out of the hands of their parents so that the so-called experts can deal with them, they don't seem to understand that the parents who may not have PhDs, may not have a lot of other things, but the fact is they can do more for you than anyone. And the family in which I grew up was not educated. I remember when we moved to New York, and the schools in New York were so much more advanced than schools in the South. The tradition was to put back a Southern kid a year when he went to school, but I talked the principal into letting me stay in that, and it was one of those Pyrrhic victories because I really was not ready for it. And when I came home, and I could ask the adults to help me with the homework, and I was told, we don't have enough education ourselves to help you.
Oh, really?
And it was brought home to me again by the time I got myself together. I was promoted to the 7th grade. And there was such a to-do in the family. And I said, why is this time rather than before? And they said, you've now gone further than any of us.
To 7th grade?
Yes.
Again, Tom, a personal odyssey. The first house I remember was a wooden house at 1121 East Hill Street in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was on an unpaved street, like most of the streets in the black neighborhoods. There was a living room, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. That's 4 rooms for, as I count, the family was 5, including you. In the kitchen, there was a wood-burning stove. The toilet was a little shed on the back porch. For heat in the winter, we had the stove, a fireplace in the living room, and a kerosene heater. For light at night, we had kerosene lamps. It never occurred to me that we were living in poverty.
Yeah.
Close quote. So what does that tell us, or am I overreading it? Does that tell us that poverty is there's some element of poverty that is subjective?
Yes, yes. And as anyone who reads the history of groups like the Eastern European Jews or the Irish before them who immigrated to the United States, the conditions under which they lived were worse than the ones in which I lived. But they didn't spend their time worrying about that. Milton Friedman at some place mentioned that his mother worked in what were called sweatshops, long hours, low pay, and so forth. He never heard her complain about it. She was glad to have the job, and it gave her a chance to try to learn English at the same time. But now you make such a to-do about it that everyone feels that they're entitled to this and that and so forth.
1939, you're now 9 years old, and your family leaves North Carolina for New York, a personal odyssey. We lived on the top floor of our building at 720 St. Nicholas Avenue. We had a gas stove, hot running water, and a built-in bathtub, all for the first time. The adults in the family had never had the opportunities that I, little Tommy, that I would now have in New York, including the opportunity for a good education, and they wanted me to make the most of those opportunities. It was a theme I would hear again and again over the years,
Yeah.
Close quote. You mentioned this yourself a moment ago, but when I read that account, I thought to myself, this sounds so much like an immigrant account.
Yes.
That moving from the South, it was simply the South to you. To me, it's the old South. It's a different era. It's that during that century when the South was almost its own country, moving from the South to New York was almost like moving from Poland or Sicily to New York.
No question about it.
No question about it. Describe your first trip to the public library.
Oh, heavens. Before I moved up to New York, other family members had gone ahead, as often happens in these kind of situations, with immigrants as well as blacks moving out of the South. And somehow in the middle of Harlem, they ran into a kid who was very intelligent, very well-read, and so forth. And and so the light bulb went off in their head that this is somebody that can be helpful to Tommy, because this kid knew things that they didn't know, and so on.
He knew his way around the neighborhood. And
yes,
right.
Yes, and Eddie Mapp was his name. And so they persuaded him to come in, sort of take me under his wing, and he decided to take me to a public library. And I was puzzled as to why I was in this building with all these books. I'd never seen so many books, and I didn't have enough money to buy one book, so I don't, what am I doing here? I was already thinking like a Chicago economist. It took a lot of persuasion on his part to get me to venture to take out a library card. And so I got a library card and even borrowed 2 books. And I arrived in New York in May, and of course I wouldn't be in a school until September. So there were no kids to play with and so forth. So it was a pretty dreary existence. And so I had these books, and that's when I first got the habit of reading books.
At the age of 9.
Yes, yes, and that's quite late. And eventually I would, of course, have learned about public libraries, but eventually it might be too late.
Tom, you write, when you were in the South, you said at one point that white people were almost hypothetical to you. You had very little to do with white people. And yet there's an account, there's a white man who visits the neighborhood. I think he was a repairman of some kind.
No, he was a farmer, and he had his produce that he was selling.
He was selling produce in the neighborhood, and you played for a little while with his little girl.
Yes.
And then your adoptive mother said to you afterwards, you've just taken your first step toward the gallows.
Yes.
So you get this sense of menace in the South.
Oh, yes.
Toward black people.
Yeah.
What about Harlem? Did Harlem feel safe?
Well, everything is relative, but we didn't have the racial problems. We had other problems because there were a lot of kids who did more fighting at the school in Harlem, and because I still had a Southern accent, they would pick on me, you see, and I would try to reason with them. And one day, when I could run out of reasons, I simply grabbed one kid's head and smashed his face into a stone wall. And I discovered that people stopped bothering me. And it's a lesson I have kept in my mind up to this present day.
I have to admit, Tom, you were a tough kid. And I hadn't realized quite what a scrapper you were, but I did think to myself when I was reading this book, Tom and I have had little disagreements, but thank goodness they stayed little. I'm not sure how well I would have come out of a major disagreement. You write at some length about the schools you attended in New York. Some schools were better than others, and some teachers were better than others, but you got a good education.
Yes.
How much of that credit, in fact, this is a kind of a question that runs all the way through a personal odyssey, the old nurture versus nature, but how much of that credit for the education you got goes to the schools, and how much was just Tom Sowell was unusually bright. That also comes through, that on all the IQ tests, you're constantly being placed in with the smarter kids. You start reading at the age of 9. How much was just plain you, and how much was the schools?
Well, that's a tough one. For a long time, I don't have a dog in this fight about nature versus
nature versus nurture, right?
Because eventually I did learn that I had a family that I was born into, and I didn't meet my brothers until I was 20 years old, and it was clear that I was more like them than I was like anybody in the family that raised me.
Oh, really? All right. So the nurture was obvious.
Yes, I remember one particular. We'd been attracted to the same kinds of poetry and so forth. And one time I was in a car where my brother was driving, and we had a big traffic jam. Just sat there for a long time, and he said, "As idle as a painted ship," and I said, "Upon a painted ocean." You know.
You could finish the poetry for him.
Yes,
You've been reading the same things and remembering the same things.
Another time, he said, "It was many and many a year ago when I said, in a kingdom by the sea." And one of the decisive things to me was much later when I was grown and had my son, and I was staying someplace, we're waiting for my oldest brother to come over and talk. And when guy came in, I said, I'll take you outside where my son is, so you can. I'll introduce you to him. And he said, "I've already met him. We've had a conversation." And I said, "How did you pick him out with all those kids out there?" He says, "Tommy, when I see a dozen kids out there all doing the same thing, and in the midst there's one kid doing something entirely different, I know who our mother's grandson is."
Got it. Back to New York. you went on to high school, and a couple of major events take place. The high school that you got into was Stuyvesant High School.
Stuyvesant, yes.
Which was one of the most prestigious schools in the public school system in New York. You had to take exams to get into that, so it was a big deal to get into Stuyvesant. And then you discovered it was just too much to get from where you were living in Harlem all the way down to Stuyvesant High. You write in the book about the commute. You have to take the subway and change it takes an hour in each direction. You got ill your first year and missed a number of weeks. And you dropped out of high school. And things got difficult at home. And you left home. So you're now 16 years old, living in a room at something called the Home for Homeless Boys, while holding a full-time job as a Western Union messenger.
Well, you have a sequence a little out that I went to the Home for Homeless Boys. I stayed there 3 days because I had a job.
I see.
And so I was no longer working for Western Union. I was working for people in the garment district. And so I then moved into this a little place that had a room for rent. And the room was less than a third the size of my bathroom at home today. And there was no closet. There was just a
hook?
No, there was a nail in the wall and that was sufficient for my wardrobe at the time. So that was the way that came about.
So you knocked around. You considered becoming an illustrator. The training was too expensive. You tried out for the Dodgers.
Oh, my. Everyone has a scandal in their lives.
But you missed a couple of grounders at first base, so they never even let you hit, which would have been your strength. And it was rough. A personal odyssey. 1949 would turn out to be one of the worst years of my life. It was a recession year, and I was plagued with recurrent unemployment. I walked the streets looking for work seemingly forever. Each day, I would decide which was the most promising job to go for and would arrive early enough to be the first in line. When that interview was over, it was off to the next job on the list, and so on all day long until I finally returned home, tired and dispirited. I finally got a part-time job, working at night in a machine shop on the Lower East Side. I knew where to buy day-old bread for 5 cents a loaf and a jar of jelly for 10 cents. That and water constituted my meals. This may sound impertinent, but was that to be endured, or did you learn from that experience? From those years, this goes on for years.
Both. I think both. Yes. A few years later, when I was in the Marine Corps, I remember someone was coming around selling something in the barracks. Everybody was for a quarter, and everybody was snapping it up, and I was pondering it, And eventually I said, I think I'll take one or something. I said, oh, Diamond Jim Sowell is going to spend a quarter, because I become very conscious of while watching my expenditures from that kind of experience in 1949.
You were eating on 15 cents a day.
Well,
loaf of bread and a personal odyssey. Again, now these are during rough times, but what comes through here again and again is books, the desire to learn. One day, I found an old secondhand set of encyclopedias. Now, it's striking that you remember the price, for $1.17. And I bought it. One of the entries was about Karl Marx, to whose ideas I was attracted for the next decade. These ideas seemed to explain so much in a way to which my grim experience made me receptive. All right, I read that and say to myself, this is one of the few times in your life when you're so low that you're open to thinking of yourself as unfortunate, perhaps, not a victim exactly, but here it is in the late 40s, early 50s America, and you turn to somebody who can explain things on class rather than race. Why is that? It just made more sense to you.
Yes, but the other thing too is the education system then and now offers very little in the way of explanations, and so this is the first vision of the world that there was. In other words, there was nothing about the Federalist Papers or things like that would explain why this is done this way and so on. And when there's not much competition, you go with what looks the most promising.
I see. But okay, you read Marx thoroughly. Another place you talk about, you knew Marx by the time you got to Harvard, which we'll come to in a moment, but you knew Marx backwards and forwards. That's the phrase you use because you've been reading it so thoroughly for so many years. But you didn't become a member of the party.
Oh no, because I had skepticism, and also I had been told that the Communist Party in the United States was not a regular party. They were simply in a branch of the Soviet Union's system, and the crucial thing was that World War II was going on in 1941, and the Soviet Union was initially on the side of the Nazis, and then in June of 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. The Daily Worker, which was the communist newspaper, up to that time has been saying the United States shouldn't get involved in this war. It's not our war, and so forth. Suddenly, the United States should get into the war. Literally from one day to the next. And again, I had this empiricism. I read that in a book by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And so I went down to the main public library and got out the old copies of the Daily Worker down there and read it for myself. And that's something, unfortunately, that very few students are taught to do today. You go along with which way the rhetoric happens to be running, and if it sounds good to you, that's what you go with. But no, I went there and checked it out for myself, and that immunized me from going that route.
You were too much of an empiricist and a contrarian to become a communist.
Yes, I guess.
I think the Cold War might have ended 20 years earlier if you had become a communist. You would have brought them down from the inside, Tom. All right. So you get a pretty good job in a machine shop.
Yes.
But you have an accident, you maul a finger, and you move down to Washington and get a job in the civil service. I'm quoting you again. The government job was all right, and the steady income, about $47 a week before taxes, was good. The city of Washington, however, increasingly got on my nerves. At a number of fast food places downtown, whites could sit down and eat, but blacks could only eat standing up at the counter. I went hungry rather than subject myself to that. In November 1950, I wrote a long letter to the Washington Star, urging the desegregation of the city's public schools. It was the first thing I had written that I know was published. Close quote. So you are conscious right from the get-go of racial injustice, and it makes you angry. You'll go hungry rather than put up with that kind of humiliation. And yet, Tom, this is difficult to convey to people who haven't read the whole book, but in your own life, the notion of racial injustice, even of race itself, is a side issue. It appears from time to time. The main narrative is Tom Sowell working at different jobs, trying to figure out how to get ahead, reading books. And so we get this notion, you argue in some of these many of these 3 books that I've said that you've written, you argue that it's a mistake to put your faith and particularly your energies in politics. You should be putting your faith in yourself and engaging in self-development. Yeah. And somehow that was just part of your outlook. It's what you did. Or did you think things through? Did you say to yourself, I don't have time to get involved, to become some sort of racial activist? How conscious was your thinking about how to handle the race question while you were so busy struggling to get an education, hold down good jobs, and so forth?
Oh, I guess it was one of many things that I thought about. But again, I was an empiricist, and I know that many of the things that were said to be causing one thing, causing another. Don't stand up if you really scrutinize them and logically analyze.
Got it. All right. Spring of 1951, you return from Washington to New York, go back to work in a machine shop, but with the Korean War taking place, by that autumn, you find yourself inducted into the United States Marine Corps, where you served as an official photographer, achieving an honorable discharge in 1952. Here's what you say in a personal odyssey about your promotion from private to corporal. No one who knew me in the Marine Corps ever questioned why I never made sergeant, but quite a few expressed amazement that I was not busted back to private.
Yes, I was not a conformist.
So we haven't, well, we touched on this jokingly a moment ago, but you really were a tough guy. In the Marine Corps, you recount a lot of the fights you get into, and you actually were boxing in the Marine Corps. So by the time you're in the Corps, in this book, the reader sees Tom Sowell is smart. He has a very well-established sense of himself. He's contrarian, he's defiant, he's empirical, but he's also a really tough young man. Where did the toughness come from?
Heaven knows. I guess that could be the old nature and nurture thing, because my oldest brother was like that.
Oh, was that so?
Yeah, he was working for the post office, and there was some criminal did something, and he just went out there and overpowered him. Oh, the other thing about him, there were riots, race riots in Washington in 1963, I believe, and I couldn't get him at home, and I wondered what was going on. I later discovered he was out there in the midst of the rioters, and he was saying things like, after you burn down this man's store, where are you going to shop? Now, I would not have thought a riot was a place for Socratic dialogue. But
actually, you would have, Tom. If you'd been in a riot, that's exactly the kind of thing you'd have done, I would think. All right. Student life. You discharged from the Marine Corps. You get a job in the stockroom of a camera store, and you start attending school at night. A personal odyssey.
I didn't start. I had been going to school at night prior to entering the Marine Corps.
Oh, okay. So you continue going to school at night. Mm-hmm. One night as I was leaving the store, I mentioned to the elevator man that I was too tired to go to school that evening. He became distressed, almost alarmed. What did the elevator man say to you?
He said, go in even though you don't feel like it. And he looked back on his own life. He was British. And he was saying that at one time as a young man, he had an opportunity to go to Australia for some big opportunity there, and he passed it up, and he's always regretted it since then.
And that made an impression?
Yes, yes.
All right. So you went to night school. New York, you go back to Washington, another civil service job, and Howard University as a part-time student. There you studied with Sterling Brown,
yes,
a very distinguished poet and literary critic. You gave him a short story in a class on writing, on composition. He marked it up in detail, and you saw that fiction was not going to be your future. But, I'm quoting you again, I did acquire an appreciation of the beauty and power of plain writing, which helped me the rest of my life, close quote. Mm. The beauty of plain writing.
Yes.
How did that strike you?
Well, I've been writing fiction before that, and studying under Sterling Brown let me see how what the writing doesn't have to be pretentious. You just put the words down there and roll.
So under Sterling Brown, you discovered. This is me speculating here, but you discovered a mode of prose that fit you.
Yes.
Unpretentious, straightforward, factual. All right. Aside from Sterling Brown, you found the instruction at Howard disappointing, and you applied for a transfer and soon found yourself at Harvard. Now, this doesn't happen to every person who wants to apply, who applies for a transfer from Howard. But you go to Harvard, and your first midterm grades are 2 Ds and 2 Fs.
Yes.
And as is clear in this book, right up until then, Tom Sowell succeeds in school every time he's in school.
Yeah.
All right. Over the Christmas break, and again, I'm going to quote you, I memorized German words by the hour, worked out math problems, taught myself to use a slide rule, and went through the chemistry textbook, solving every problem in it from cover to cover. Things began to fall into place, and material that had once seemed impenetrable now turned out to be quite manageable. I graduated from Harvard, magna cum laude, close quote. Okay, so another one of these something along the theme of nurture versus nature, nature versus nurture. Did Harvard teach you that academic work ethic? Lord knows you were hardworking.
Yeah.
Did Harvard teach you how to apply your work ethic to academic work? Or was it simply a matter of bringing into play the work ethic?
Much simpler than that. One of my roommates said to me one day, Tom, when are you going to stop goofing off and get some work done? I said, goofing off?
You've been working as far as you could tell.
Yes. But when the grades came out, I thought, well, it's time to reassess things. And I was told, I was going to have to shape up or ship out. And I didn't have any place to ship out to, so that narrowed the options. There was also when because I had such a bad time, I had another roommate there, and after in the fall semester I had four C's, and the spring semester I had 4 B's, and I was looking through the catalog one day, and I said, Mike, do you realize that at this late date I could still graduate magna cum laude? And he burst out laughing. And I graduated.
That's all you needed to the challenge, the code. A personal odyssey. Quote, Harvard made a major contribution to my development, but when time came to leave, I felt that it was not a moment too soon.
Yeah.
Why?
I guess I saw, there was a certain smugness. You may have heard the old saying, you can always tell a Harvard man, but you can't tell him much. And I remember a few times I'd run into those people, and I would sometimes argue with him, get him out on a limb, and I argue and then cut the limb off. And I remember my same roommate who had laughed at me was saying, did you really have to make a fool of him in front of all those people? And I said, don't give me too much credit. I had good raw material. I said, you can't please all the people all the time. He said, you're not pleasing any of the people any of the time. And it was true. It's painful sometimes. I get letters from young black students in college that say they sort of feel sorry for me for having gone through school during this racist period and all. And I thought back, I don't remember a single racist remark at Harvard.
Really?
The closest thing to it was a student from Britain who was would be referred to as nasty British in short. And I was the one who said it.
You did?
Yes.
You once told me that the principal advantage of a Harvard degree was that you never again in all your life have to feel intimidated by somebody who holds a Harvard degree.
That's it.
That's it. All right. From Harvard to Columbia, where you wrote your master's thesis under Arthur Burns, who's one of the major figures of in the field of economics in the second half of the 20th century, then on to doctoral work in economics at the University of Chicago, where you studied with Milton Friedman and George Stigler, both of whom would go on to win the Nobel Prize. And to win the Nobel Prize for a particular kind of economics, free market economics. Quote, I was as well aware that the University of Chicago economics department had a reputation for conservatism, as they were that I was a Marxist, close quote. Yeah. Well, how did that work?
Worked out fine.
Between you and Milton Friedman?
Yes.
Between you and George Stigler?
Yeah, well...
They didn't say, Mr. Sowell, you're very mistaken?
No, I was much more in tune with them, and I had much more respect for Chicago than I ever had for Harvard. And
because it was empirical? Because their approach was empirical?
Yes, because we didn't go on this notion that because we are the wonderful people, if we all believe something that makes it true. In Chicago, you had to argue tooth and nail. And years later, when I was being interviewed for an appointment at UCLA, which at that time was known as the West Coast office of the University of Chicago, economics department, and they had a bunch of University of Chicago people in that department, and we got into a hot back and forth in the thing. I mean, I did open up by taking a shot at one of the senior members of the professor, which is not the way you should act at an employment.
You were the one being interviewed, and
yes.
You took a shot at a major. All right.
Yeah, and there was a lady there from the administration, and she was so shocked at the fierceness of this thing. She went to the department chairman, and I obviously I got this story from them, and she said, "If you don't want to hire Sowell, that's your business. But you didn't have to attack him that the way you did." You said. I've never seen such hostility. And the department chairman, who was also a Chicago economist, said, "What are you talking about? These guys love Tom. Of course we're going to hire him." And later on, I remember being invited to go back to Chicago and give a speech or talk on something or other. And I asked the guy, "Well, what's the format for this thing?" He said, "You know how these things go, Tom. You try to make your point, and we try to show what a damn fool you are." And that's the way Chicago economists operated. By the way, my respect for Chicago, I found was validated because toward the end of the 20th century, there were 9 Chicago economists at Chicago who won the Nobel Prize compared to 1 at Harvard.
All right. 1960, you returned to Washington from Chicago to become an economist at the Department of Labor. Again, I'm quoting you. "I had remained a Marxist despite being at the University of Chicago, but now my experience in Washington began a process of changing my mind completely." Well, we already know it's not easy to change your mind. What did it?
Oh, evidence. I was a big. I was much in favor of minimum wage laws. I thought that the people have low income, they can get a little better life for themselves and so forth. But at Chicago, there was the idea, that what you do when you raise the minimum wage is you cause lots of people to lose their jobs or not be able to find a job. And in fact, that was what I've been saying for a decade since then. But there were 2 explanations of why the unemployment went up, and this is in Puerto Rico that I was studying. Went up after the minimum wages, and that was because there were storms that came through Puerto Rico several years in a row, and they destroyed part of the sugar crop, and therefore there was less need for workers, and that was the reason for their unemployment. And I remember that in Chicago they say if there's 2 different contradictory theories, there ought to be something that is empirically valid, that some facts that will fit one theory that will not fit the other. And so I made it my job to think of what those would be. And one morning I came in, I said, "I've got it. We need statistical data on the amount of sugar standing in the field before the storm came in." And I sat there to wait for the applause, and I saw looks of horror on the students' face, on the other economists' faces, like this guy has stumbled on something that will ruin us all, because 1/3 of the money for the Labor Department came from administering the minimum wage law. And I suddenly realized that the people who were pushing this were not necessarily looking out for the poor. They were looking out for their own careers. And once you start thinking along those lines, then especially, but what happened too was they said, well, we don't have those statistics. I said, I'll bet they have it at the Department of Agriculture. And he said, yes, but we can't just get it. You would have to send a note up to the Secretary of Labor. And he would confer with the Secretary of Agriculture to see if those data are available. And he would go down and it's the line at the edge of the people who have that, and then he'll come back and say whether it's available. So I said, well, you know, the president said that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So I will write the department. I'm a summer intern in this place.
Oh,
and I will send a note to the Secretary of Labor, which I did, and I am still patiently waiting for his answer 50 years later.
Quoting you, this forced me to realize that government agencies have their own self-interest to look after,
yes,
regardless of the interest of those for whom a program has been set up. The more government programs I looked into, the harder I found it to believe they were a net benefit to society.
Yes, yes.
If I'd been in that Department of Labor, I would have wished you were a communist activist. Teaching. You get your doctorate from the University of Chicago. Your first teaching job is at Douglas College, women's college in New Jersey. Quote, with all the exhausting work involved in preparing every lecture from scratch for the first time, I still looked forward to my classes and felt a certain regret when I finished the last one on Thursday afternoon and realized that I would not see the students again until Monday. You loved teaching.
Yes.
You enjoyed being in a classroom. You liked the back and forth. You liked seeing minds make progress. After some months, here's a conversation that takes place between you and your Douglas Economics Department chairman. And I've taken this, of course, from Personal Odyssey, department chair. Quote, the feeling I get, Sowell, is that you aim your course at the A and B students, but you've got to scoop lower and bring the C and D students up there. Thomas Sowell replies, anybody who can get into Douglas College can make a B in my course. The students you want me to concentrate on are those who don't want to get an education. And the story concludes in a Personal Odyssey. A few days later, I left my resignation in his mailbox. You loved teaching, but you insisted on standards. All these years later, when you look back, any regrets? Should you have found some way to accommodate?
No.
All right. You didn't have to think about that one.
Oh, good heavens. Well, my other things, I wanted to go into teaching immediately after I finished at Chicago, but it didn't happen. I realized what a blessing it was, because I took a job in the government, and when I finally decided I would take an academic job, it required me to take about a 20% pay cut, which I could not afford so readily at that time. And then later, I went to work for AT&T back when it was the world's largest corporation, and and so I was now making at least twice as much there, and so I was never I never worried about my academic career.
Oh, you didn't?
Because when I was teaching at Cornell, I had my little differences of opinion with some of the senior members of the department, and I was just an assistant professor on a 3-year contract, and when there was some discussion about some issue that came up, and apparently the senior members of the department wanted things done a certain way, and I said, it doesn't matter to me. And he said, well, these are people who are going to be voting on whether your contract will be renewed. And I got up and walked out of his office. I said, since I make my decisions as I see fit, I assume they'll make theirs as they see fit. And when I told my wife about what happened, and she said, what if you get fired? I said, I'll go back to AT&T. We can use the money. She said, give them hell.
All right. Well, you've anticipated me a little bit here because you go from Douglas to Howard, and here we have it at Howard. Again, I take this department chair at Howard.
Yes.
For God's sake, Sowell, you're not teaching at Harvard. Kids from these backgrounds, he's talking about black kids at Howard. Kids from these backgrounds can't handle a lot of abstractions and graphs. Thomas Sowell, yes, they can, but not as long as they have administrators to intervene on their behalf. If you think I'm not doing my job, you can have my resignation anytime. And you did not stay at Howard all that long.
No.
And then at Cornell, there's a summer program you're running for black students, and there's a kid who's not performing and you want him kicked out, and the department chairman overrules you and says, no, he's black, we have to keep him.
Mm-hmm.
And well, you write, unlike my long resignation letter at Howard University, my resignation from Cornell consisted of only one sentence. I had learned the futility of trying to talk sense to people who don't want to hear it, close quote. I just have one more time. It's this whipsaw reading this book because it's clear you just love teaching. Yeah. You liked the kids. You liked talking to the kids. You particularly felt a kinship with the black kids who wanted to perform, but you would not bend standards.
Well, because otherwise, if you want to be a politician who's trying to protect your career in academia, you can do that. But there was no reason to do it otherwise, because I could always make more money somewhere else.
All right. Okay. You teach for a year at Brandeis, you move to UCLA, you conduct a study for the Urban Institute, you accept a visiting appointment at Stanford. Throughout this period, you begin publishing. You've published in academic journals already, but now you begin book publishing. Your Black Education, Myths and Tragedies appears in 1972.
Yeah.
Knowledge and Decisions, a huge book, very serious book, appears in 1979.
80.
80? Okay, 1980. And also in 1980.
That's what got me appointed at Hoover.
Okay. And in 1980, you joined the Hoover Institution. A personal odyssey. My position at Hoover would turn out to be the longest job I ever held and the most satisfying. It would allow me to devote my time entirely to research. So with your appointment to Hoover, I think that's a reasonable place to say this is the end of the early life, and this is where Tom Sowell begins to become the Thomas Sowell. And you've published hundreds of columns, all of these books at the Hoover Institution, incidentally, including a column. How old are you now, Tom?
94.
94. A column in the Wall Street Journal this past autumn on the presidential campaign. This is not the typical activity of most 94-year-olds. Okay. So you give up teaching to spend time at the Hoover Institution, where teaching is not part of the job. You do your research and your writing. And I received a letter not long ago from a young man in Ghana. I am 31 and have all these years avoided economics because it was too complicated until I discovered Thomas Sowell. I have spent hours watching your interviews with Sowell. My blood runs strong when I find wise men and the books they have written. If you have the possibility, send me books you deem relevant to leadership right here in Africa. Well, you will not be surprised to hear that I boxed up a dozen of your books and sent them off to Accra. But I'm just wondering, you did love teaching, but are you conscious of the reach you've had through your books in all these years?
Not really, because I don't.
Doesn't interest you?
Well, it's nice, but.
All right. I remember, Tom, this happened maybe 15 years ago. I shouldn't name the names, but a big organization called me and said, we're holding a conference in Palm Springs. We'll send a car for Dr. Sowell. We'll have a private jet fly him down from San Francisco to Palm Springs. Lunch, we'd like him to talk for an hour, then a car back to the airport, we'll private jet back. He'll be home. It's a half a day. And we'll pay him, and then they named a staggering sum. So I passed that request along through your office, and word came back, Dr. Sowell is not interested. He's busy reading and writing. By the way, I offered to do it for half as much myself. So it's so all these books, including more than half a dozen books since the age of 80, and if you're not exulting in letters from Ghana and all the people who see you on YouTube and and so on, it's the work itself. It's what keeps you at it, Tom?
Well, it's something that I feel like doing, and I enjoy doing, and hope that some of it will make some difference to somebody somewhere.
Well, all right. So we know one kid in Accra, the capital of Ghana, who's
one.
working his way through a dozen books.
I'll presumably find a second and third one somewhere.
I think so. From your summing up in A Personal Odyssey, in some ways, my life was much like that of many other blacks. In other ways, it was quite different. And then you say this very striking sentence, perhaps most important, I grew up with no fear of whites. Why was that important?
Because there are a lot of people who are working out their fears and things like that. And if you don't have any, you don't have that distraction.
Intellectual intimidation, or, well, actually, you were either one. You knocked them. You had no physical intimidation or intellectual intimidation.
No, the first time I went to a school that was predominantly white, it was in the 7th grade, and they had what's called ability grouping. So it's and I was, and for example, the 7A1 would be the best school class in the 7th grade, first semester of it, and so on. But this school also had a 7AR, which was a rapid advancement place, and for that it was for students with IQs of 120 and above. And I was in the 7A1, and then someone in the office went through the records to see if there were any kids that had IQ of 120 who were not in the R class, and they were 4. And the 4 of us were all offered an opportunity to transfer into the R class. The other 3 took it immediately. And I said, I'm happy where I am. But fortunately for me, they put me in there anyway. But I mean, it's that thing. Something that I've never wanted to be part of something that was special or something like that. I mean, there are people whose lives I think have been ruined because they either wanted to be in some special group that they thought was so terrific, or else they got that, and they got it by overcoming their own thoughts and things to be, and that I think is one of the great tragic aspects of academic life now. That when I see these people out there rioting and so on for stuff that they totally misunderstand, but they feel a need to be with a crowd that's doing these things that are supposed to be so great. And it's a matter. And again, this is something I think I see in my brothers and my sister. That just doesn't. And I think that's one of the things that made Walter and me.
Walter Williams, your longtime friend.
Yes. At one time, someone said the black conservative movement consists of Sowell and Williams, But the thing that Walter and I have in common, Walter did not care what anybody thought about what he did. And he was that way in the military. I mean, Walter was indicted for a court-martial in the Army, and I in the Marine Corps. But that just didn't matter to him, and I think that's the difference. And unfortunately, our schools are turning out people who want to be part of some great something or other, and who therefore will go along with all kinds of things that seem to fit that bill, rather than questioning it.
You can make a list, I think. The reader of this book, the reader of your books generally, can make a list. What Tom Sowell loves: facts, argument, What Tom Sowell hates, conformism. That would be one of the leading,
Yeah.
wouldn't it? All right.
Yeah.
You write, I can see that I was lucky in many ways. Let me ask you about a couple of the ways in which you say you were lucky. Here's one. In New York, I passed through the public schools at a time when they were better than they had been for the European immigrant children of a generation earlier, and far better than they would be for black children of a later era.
Yes.
You just got lucky. You attribute that purely to luck.
That one time, one of the relatives of mine in the family that raised me, she was younger. I remember was saying at one point in her middle ages, she said, "I didn't." She blamed herself for not taking advantage, and she said, "I went to the same school you went to, Uncle Tommy," and I said, "No, you went to the same building I went to. When you got there, it was not the same school anymore."
I happened to come along, I'm quoting you again, I happened to come along right after the worst of the old discrimination was no longer there to impede me, and just before racial quotas made the achievements of blacks look suspect.
Yes.
You beat the worst of Jim Crow, and yet you got your degrees and established your career before affirmative action became widespread.
Yeah.
That's what you were arguing.
Yes.
And that's luck as well.
Yes. The other luck was that the first thing I was most interested in my career was the history of ideas. And it so happens that the economic journals in Britain were more interested in that than the ones in the United States. And so in the first decade of my publishing, I published more in Britain than I did in the United States. And so I had an article in the American Economic Review, but in the United States. But I had two articles in a journal published at Oxford, and one published in the London School of Economics, and others overseas. So that I never had to worry as to whether I was getting this because I was black or whatnot. They had no idea what color I was on the other side of the Atlantic.
You submitted the piece of writing and the piece of writing only. They didn't know who you were.
That's right.
Got it. All right. Couple of final questions. You acknowledge those hard times when you're living on day-old bread, working in a machine shop, and yet what comes through is not a sense of grievance or victimization. It now seems, I'm quoting you, it now seems almost as if someone had decided that there should be a man with all the outward indications of disadvantage who nevertheless had the key inner advantages needed to advance, close quote. We've never discussed this, and I'm not sure it interests you particularly, but have you ever, who is the someone who made this decision? Have you ever thought through questions of religion or divine providence, or does that simply not interest you?
I've not thought, in those terms. But also, years ago, there was a very favorable article about me in one of the magazines, and they expressed amazement that I could come through Harlem and go on off to Harvard and all these other places. And I got a letter shortly thereafter by an attorney who grew up 3 blocks from where I lived in Harlem. And he was saying, this is not such a strange thing. There are people like that in the tenement where I grew up. And over the years, I have learned that there are any number of blacks within a 5-block radius of where I was who are both financially more successful and far better known than I am. And it was a time, and the people of that time. One of the people I found out about was told me about his situation, and he said there were times when he would, when his father at dinner time would sit there watching the kids eat and not eating anything himself. And when you come out of a family like that, and there's a good school system, it's not miraculous.
You take off.
And the thing is now you have kids like that, and you don't have as many families like that. In fact, you don't have that many families that has a father at all. And that, a lot of data shows that that is a devastating handicap, mostly for boys, but also for girls. And that's what so you've created the welfare state, destroyed the family, and the net result, you've made a lot of people worse off while you thought you were making them better off.
Tom, the United States. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes that, quote, "The American dream cannot exist without racial injustice." His argument is that the country has depended since its founding on the exploitation of African Americans. You suffered hard times. You thought so little of the country's economic system that for years you were a Marxist. You opposed the Vietnam War, although in later life you were generally approving of Reagan's economic policies. You say in this book that you thought Reagan himself just did not understand the black experience. And yet for all that, you lived a version of the American dream, from Jim Crow to Harlem to all these books. So I've read what Ta-Nehisi Coates makes of this country. What do you make of the United States? What's your summary statement on this country?
Well, like all other human societies, it was not perfect. But if you compare it not to the perfection or an ideal, but to the other countries, it's hard to find another one that can match it.
Last question. The whole point of looking back on my life, aside from the pleasure of sharing reminiscences, is to hope that others will find something useful for their own lives. So may I take a stab at that? There are many lessons from the books you've written, but there are also lessons to be drawn from your life. Very few people will ever possess your sheer intelligence, but we can all aspire to develop our abilities, to work at our abilities as you worked on yours. We can all reject victimization. We can all learn to think for ourselves. We can all defy high-sounding nonsense and insist on logic and evidence. And we can all display gratitude. Will you accept that?
Sounds good to me.
All right. Tom Sowell, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've interviewed Tom over and over again over the last quarter of a century now. I like Tom because I just like Tom. That laugh, his warmth, the quickness, the brilliance, the slightly cutting humor when I ask a question that might not be as good as he thinks it ought to have been. I've always enjoyed Tom for himself. But there are attributes of his that I not only enjoy but admire. The moral authority. Tom Sowell belongs to the last generation to have experienced Jim Crow. Other people can talk about the Old South. Tom Sowell grew up there. When he was a student at Howard University in Washington, D.C., there were diners in downtown Washington where only the white people could sit down. And as Tom has said, whenever he found himself in such a place, he'd rather go hungry than submit himself to that kind of indignity. The kind of intellectual self-confidence that can remark, as Tom has remarked a number of times over the years, that the principal advantage of holding a Harvard degree, as he does, is that never again in all your life do you have to feel intimidated by someone who holds a Harvard degree. Or his sheer work ethic. Listen to this list of titles. The Thomas Sowell Reader, Economic Facts and Fallacies, 2nd edition, Intellectuals and Race, Basic Economics, 5th edition, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, an International Perspective, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, 2nd edition, Discrimination and Disparities, Discrimination and Disparities Revised and Enlarged, Charter Schools and Their Enemies, Social Justice Fallacies. What do all these titles have in common? These are all books that Tom Sowell wrote after turning 80. And by the way, he's at work on another book right now. So I suppose it's the mind of Tom Sowell that I myself have come most to appreciate. Always he thinks for himself. Always he insists upon learning the facts. Never has he truckled. Never has he swayed. Never has he been influenced by a mere climate of opinion. He stands on his own 2 feet and thinks with his own mind, Thomas Sowell is a free man. For Uncommon Knowledge, the Hoover Institution, and Fox Nation, I'm Peter Robinson.